All right, class. Welcome to Chapter 9 of the Narrative and Life of Frederick Douglass. Just a brief review from Chapter 8. We had that awful story of Frederick Douglass's grandmother and how she was treated in her old age, put in a hut out in the woods um, to live alone. And then we find out he's had a lot of masters dying and then their family members passing away. And so he's now been transferred again to another master, um, and he's leaving Baltimore. Okay, and this is when he decides again that he is going to escape when he first gets the chance. So, chapter 9, page 30. I have now reached a period in my life where I can give dates. I left Baltimore and went to live with Master Thomas Ould at St. Michael's in March 1832. It was now more than 7 years since I lived with him in the family of my old master on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. We, of course, were now almost entire strangers to each other. He was to me a new master, and I to him a new slave. I was ignorant of his temper and disposition. He was equally so of mine. A very short time, however, brought us into full acquaintance with each other. I was made acquainted with his wife not less than with himself. They were well matched, being equally mean and cruel. I was now, for the first time during a space of more than 7 years, made to feel the painful gnawings of hunger, a something which I had not experienced before, or since I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. Remember, in the city, he always had enough to eat. People had a reputation to uphold in the city. They didn't want their slaves looking beat down and miserable and hungry. So they were always, usually always well fed. But now he is experiencing hunger again. It went hard enough with me then when I could look back to no period at which I had enjoyed a sufficiency. Sufficiency means having enough to eat. It was tenfold harder after living in Master Hugh's family, where I had always had enough to eat, and of that which was good. I have said Master Thomas was a mean man, and he was so. Not to give a slave enough to eat is regarded as the most aggravated development of meanness, even among slaveholders. The rule is, no matter how coarse or rough the food, only let there be enough of it. This is the theory, and in the part of Maryland from which I came, it is the general practice, though there are many exceptions. Master Thomas gave us enough of neither coarse nor fine food. There were 4 slaves of us in the kitchen, my sister Eliza, my Aunt Priscilla, Henny, and myself, and we were allowed less than half a bushel of cornmeal per week, and very little else, either in the shape of meat or vegetables. It was not enough for us to subsist upon. We were therefore reduced to the wretched necessity of living at the expense of our neighbors. This we did by begging and stealing, whichever came handy in the time of need, the one being considered as legitimate as the other. A great many times have we poor creatures been nearly perishing or dying with hunger, when food in abundance lay moldering in the safe and smokehouse, and our pious or religious mistress was aware of the fact. And yet that mistress and her husband would kneel every morning and pray that God would bless them in basket and store. So Douglass is very frustrated here. I told you in the last video, we're going to start seeing him making sarcastic comments about Christianity. Not because he dislikes Christianity, but because of the hypocrites that he sees all around him. So he sees his mistress and her husband kneeling and praying to God for blessings, praying for food, enough food to eat, and they've got a bunch already, and yet they're not feeding their slaves well enough, and their slaves are dying. Starving. Their slaves are starving. But as all slaveholders are, we seldom meet one destitute, poor, of every element of character commanding respect. My master was one of the rare sort. So he's saying no matter how bad a slaveholder is, it's very rare that there's one who's just bad in every way. Like usually they have at least one positive quality. But he says, nope, my master was one of the rare ones where they are all bad. I do not know of one single noble or good act ever performed by him. The leading trait in his character was meanness, and if there were any other element in his nature, it was made subject to this. He was mean, and like most other mean men, he lacked the ability to conceal or cover his meanness. Captain Old was not born a slaveholder. He'd been a poor man, master only of a bay craft, so just a little boat. He came into possession of all his slaves by marriage, and of all men, adopted slaveholders are the worst. Think about that. You've already seen this once in the book. Where else did we see someone who had never had slaves before, had to work for whatever they owned previously, and then they get a slave and they experience that power over another human being? And what does that do to them psychologically? What do they go from being perhaps very good to very bad? Here's another one. He was not born into slaveholding. He was poor growing up, but he marries into a family with slaves. And he's also becomes very, very bad. He came into possession of all his slaves by marriage, and of all men, adopted slaveholders are the worst. He was cruel, but cowardly. He commanded without firmness. In the enforcement of his rules, he was at times rigid and at times lax. At times he spoke of his slaves with the firmness of Napoleon and the fury of a demon, and at other times he might well be mistaken for an inquirer who had lost his way. He did nothing of himself. He might have passed for a lion but for his ears. In all things noble or good which he attempted, his own meanness shone most conspicuous. That means obvious, easy to see. His airs, words, and actions were the airs, words, and actions of born slaveholders, and being assumed were awkward enough. He was not even a good imitator. He possessed all the disposition to deceive, but wanted the power. Having no resources within himself, he was compelled to be the copyist of many, and being such, he was forever the victim of inconsistency, and of consequence, he was an object of contempt and was held as such even by his slaves. Okay. Lots of long sentences there. It says that at times he was really strict, at times he was really lax. Lax means relaxed. He's not consistent. Sometimes he's super firm with the rules, sometimes not so much. And it says that he just had to copy other people. It's like he doesn't have his own personality, he just has to imitate others. I think we probably all know people like that who just copy other people. And he's just trying to copy the attitudes of other slaveholders. It's like he doesn't have a real personality inside. The luxury of having slaves of his own to wait upon him was something new and unprepared for. He was a slaveholder without the ability to hold slaves. He found himself incapable of managing his slaves either by force, fear, or fraud. We rarely called him master. We generally called him Captain Old, and were hardly disposed to title him at all. So the slaves cannot stand him. They don't even want to give him the respectful title of master. They just call him Captain Old. Sometimes they don't even give him a title. I doubt not that our conduct had much to do with making him appear awkward, and of consequence fretful. Our want of reverence for him must have perplexed him greatly. He wished to have us call him master, but he lacked the firmness necessary to command us to do so. His wife used to insist upon our calling him so, but to no purpose. In August of 1832, my master attended a Methodist camp meeting held in the Bayside, Talbot County, and there experienced religion. Again, he's bringing in religion. The Methodist, it would just be like a branch of Christianity. You have Methodist and Baptist and missionary and Episcopalian. There's just all these different, we call them denominations, okay? And this is a Methodist one that his master goes to. I indulged a faint hope that his conversion would lead him to emancipate his slaves, and that if he did not do this, it would at any rate make him more kind and humane. So Douglass has this little hope that maybe religion will help soften him up and help him be nicer to us if he doesn't even. He's not going to set us free, maybe he'll be nicer. I was disappointed in both respects. It neither made him to be humane to his slaves nor to free them. If it had any effect on his character, it made him more cruel and hateful in all his ways. For I believe him to have been a much worse man after his conversion than before. Prior to his conversion, he relied upon his own evilness to shield and sustain him in his savage barbarity. But after his conversion, he found religious sanction and support for his slaveholding cruelty. Sanction means like permission here. He made the greatest pretensions to piety. Piety is the noun form of being pious. Okay, a pious person is very dedicated to their religion. Piety would be religious action. His house was the house of prayer. He prayed morning, noon, and night. He very soon distinguished himself among his brethren and was soon made a class leader and exhorter. His activity in revivals was great, and he proved himself an instrument in the hands of the church in converting many souls. His house was the preacher's home. They used to take great pleasure in coming there to put up, for while he starved us, he stuffed them. People like going to his house because he has great big dinner parties and feeds them while he's starving his slaves. We have had 3 or 4 preachers there at a time. The names of those who used to come most frequently while I lived there were Mr. Stort, Mr. Ewery, Mr. Humphrey, and Mr. Hickey. I have also seen Mr. George Cookman at our house. We slaves loved Mr. Cookman. We believed him to be a good man. We thought him instrumental in getting Mr. Samuel Harrison, a very rich slaveholder, to emancipate his slaves, and by some means got the impression that he was laboring to effect the emancipation of all the slaves. When he was at our house, we were sure to be called in to prayers. When the others were there, we were sometimes called in and sometimes not. Mr. Cookman took more notice of us than either of the other ministers. He could not come among us without betraying his sympathy for us. And stupid as we were, we had the sagacity to see it. So he really likes when Mr. Cookman comes. He finds out Mr. Cookman helped influence another rich slave owner to free his slaves. And whenever Mr. Cookman's there, he wants the slaves to be a part of the prayer meetings. So they like him. While I lived with my master in St. Michael's, there was a white young man, a Mr. Wilson, who proposed to keep a Sabbath school for the instruction of such slaves as might be disposed to learn to read the New Testament. So the Sabbath would be the day of worship. So in Christian society, that's Sunday. Okay. So he wants to start a school for slaves to learn to read the New Testament. We met but 3 times when Mr. West and Mr. Fairbanks, both class leaders with many others, came upon us with sticks and other missiles, drove us off, and forbade us to meet again. Thus ended our little Sabbath school in the pious town of St. Michael's. So they met 3 times before other leaders in the church drove them off with sticks and other missiles. And missiles just something you launch and throw. So probably stones or pieces of wood or something. And he says that ended our little school in the pious town of St. Michael's. Think about the tone that he's taking on there. Tone is the narrator's attitude towards what they're writing about. Okay, he's calling it a pious little town. Pious means religious and devoted to your religion. Throwing sticks at someone, at people trying to learn to read, is not the Christian thing to do. So his tone here, he's using sarcasm. All right. Frederick Douglass is going to use sarcasm a lot to point out the hypocrisy. And I know I've said this before, but I have to drive the point home. The hypocrites who say they're Christian, but that are doing these awful, terrible things to other human beings. I have said my master found religious sanction for his cruelty. As an example, I will state one of many facts going to prove the charge. I have seen him tie up a lame or injured young woman and whip her with a heavy cowskin upon her naked shoulders, causing the warm red blood to drip. And in justification of the bloody deed, he would quote this passage of scripture: "He that knoweth his master's will and does it not shall be beaten with many stripes." Okay, and that's just one of a few verses from the Bible that slaveholders would use to say, well, slavery is okay because look at these verses in the Bible. Well, those are verses taken out of context. That means out of the situation they're in. It's like you just take every sentence in the Bible and you just pull out a single one and say, oh, look, this verse says that I'm allowed to have slaves because it mentions slave holders and something. Well, no, if you read the whole thing and understood the culture and the story, the Bible does not support slavery, okay? And Douglass knows that, and he's very frustrated with these so-called Christian slave owners who are trying to use it to justify slavery. Master would keep this lacerated or cut up young woman tied up to this horrid situation 4 or 5 hours at a time. I have known him to tie her up early in the morning and whip her before breakfast, leave her, go to his store, return at dinner, and whip her again, cutting her in the places already made raw with his cruel lash. The secret of Master's cruelty toward Henny is found in the fact of her being almost helpless. When quite a child, she fell into the fire and burned herself horribly. Her hands were so burnt that she never got the use of them. She could do very little but bear heavy burdens. So her hands are destroyed. All she can do is just carry stuff in her arms because she can't grip anything. She was to Master a bill of a bill of expense. And as he was a mean man, she was a constant offense to him. He seemed desirous of getting the poor girl out of existence. He gave her away once to his sister, but being a poor gift, she was not disposed to keep her. Finally, my benevolent master, and benevolent means kind. Whenever you see ben, B-E-N in a word, that means good, kind. Okay, his master's not kind, right? So again, sarcasm. My kind master, to use his own words, set her adrift to take care of herself. Here was a recently converted man, so recently converted to being a Christian, right? Holding up upon the mother and at the same time turning out her helpless child to starve and die. Master Thomas was one of the many pious slaveholders who hold slaves for the very charitable purpose of taking care of them. Okay, again, irony. He's not pious and he's not charitable. He's a horrible, mean man who is not following any Christian principles in the treatment of these slaves. Douglass is trying to show us the hypocrisy of it. Okay, Douglass is not against Christianity or religion. He is against people who say they're Christian and religious but do horrible, awful things to other humans. My master and myself had quite a number of differences. He found me unsuitable to his purpose. My city life, he said, had had a very pernicious or bad effect upon me. It had almost ruined me for every good purpose and fitted me for everything which was bad. One of my greatest faults was that of letting his horse run away and go down to his father-in-law's farm, which was about 5 miles from St. Michael's. I would then have to go after it. My reason for this kind of carelessness or carefulness was that I could always get something to eat when I went there. Douglass purposely lets the horse get out. He says it's not carelessness, it's carefulness. He can get food when he goes to the farm where the horse always runs off to. Master William Hamilton, my master's father-in-law, always gave his slaves enough to eat. I never left there hungry, no matter how great the need of my speedy return. Master Thomas at length said he would stand it no longer. I had lived with him 9 months, during which time he had given me a number of severe whippings, all to no good purpose. He resolved to put me out, as he said, to be broken, and for this purpose he let me for 1 year to a man named Edward Covey. To let someone would be like to rent them out. Mr. Covey was a poor man, a farm renter. He rented the place upon which he lived, as also the hands with which he tilled it. Mr. Covey had acquired a very high reputation for breaking young slaves, and this reputation was of immense value to him. It enabled him to get his farm tilled with much less expense to himself than he could have had it done without such a reputation. Some slaveholders thought it not much loss to allow Mr. Covey to have their slaves 1 year for the sake of the training to which they were subjected without any other compensation. So they don't even have to get payment for it. Like they're losing the work of a slave for a whole year, but they don't need payment or anything because they're going to have a well-trained slave when that slave comes back. He could hire young help with great ease in consequence of this reputation. Added to the general good qualities of Mr. Covey, he was a professor of religion, a pious soul, a member and class leader in the Methodist Church. All of this added weight to his reputation as a slave breaker. I was aware of all the facts, having been made acquainted with them by a young man who had lived there. I nevertheless made the change gladly, for I was sure of getting enough to eat, which is not the smallest consideration to a hungry man. So again, what key detail does Douglass give us at the very end about Mr. Covey? This famous slave breaker, he was a pious man. He was a religious man. Okay. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 9. He is going to go to Mr. Covey, and we're going to see how that year in Mr. Covey's care goes for him. All right. Thanks for joining me for chapter 9. We'll see you next time.